clinician? And shouldn't the patient just trust the AI, right? Or how do we think about this? So this is one of the many interesting questions we can ask about trust. And then what Jennifer just said about, the risk centered approach about, AI is not the problem, human is the problem, right? Or do we think that, AI can be a problem, humans can be a problem, but if we still believe that AI is only a tool, then we can't hold AI accountable, but we can hold people accountable, right? So how do we resolve all these different thoughts? So our last speaker today is Kelly Owens, who is Assistant Professor of Population Health at the New York University Grossman School of Medicine. So she is a medical sociologist and empirical bioethicist. Her research focuses on the ethical use of health information technologies, understanding when and how new technologies worsen or improve health inequities, and developing better social and technical infrastructures to support AI and machine learning in healthcare. So, Kelly.
Thank you all. I am a notoriously quiet speaker, so if at some point you can't hear me, please let me know. I'm very grateful to be here. As mentioned, I am a sociologist and a science and technology studies scholar by background, so the way that I think about my training and work and expertise is to think about the people and the process underlying a lot of this technology. So that's what I'm hoping I can talk about today. There's a ton to talk about with a topic like that. So what I've chosen to highlight here is just two of our current research projects that focus on different questions in the domain of ethical and trustworthy governance for AI. I'm hoping that between those two cases, I can provide a more comprehensive discussion of many of the key considerations in ethics in this field. But I also want to continue arguing, as I think others have, that the context of each AI application are different. Their ethical considerations are going to be different as well. And whenever I have started talking about ethics of AI, I often get questions about where I stand from people's perspectives of how they see AI ethics being covered in the media or in popular literature. So I just want to give you a sense of sort of where I stand in this field and the sorts of debates that are playing in AI ethics and safety right now. So as I'm sure this audience very much knows, there's a lot of awe and a lot of panic about AI right now. And there's a bit of a split that's playing out, I think, quite publicly between folks in the field of AI safety and the field of AI ethics. And to give you a little bit of an example of that, in the field of AI safety, the biggest news story, I think, was the pause letter from last year that many of you may have seen, signed by some real heavy hitters, Yoshua Bengio, Elon Musk, suggesting that AI labs should pause for 6 months on the training of any AI model more powerful than GPT-4. And I want to read a quote from the letter to give you a sense of the tone of it, which is, contemporary AI systems are now becoming human competitive at general tasks. So we should ask ourselves, should we let machines flood our information channels with propaganda and untruth? Should we automate away all the jobs, including the fulfilling ones? Should we develop non-human minds that might eventually outnumber, outsmart, obsolete, and replace us? Should we risk loss of control of our civilization? So obviously those are really talking about like big existential risks to humanity. And I think it's important to note that a lot of the folks who might place themselves in the field of AI ethics didn't sign that pause letter, although some of them did, but were instead sort of critical of how these large existential risks are being framed. I would argue something more similar to what is quite a strong argument here from this letter, that, for example, those sort of AI existential risks are serving to generate more hype and panic than working towards solving the real and already manifesting ethics concerns. So focusing on things like we're losing control of our civilization might actually do more to serve the interests of those companies by making that technology because we're in awe of it, rather than address the real problems that we can see today. And I think there are some real ethics challenges, as we've already talked about quite a bit today. So instead, I am more in line with this editorial here, which is stop talking about AI's doomsday when AI poses risks today. So I'm not going to address here some of the more long-term risks. I'm going to focus on where this technology is now and the things that we can think about as we're governing the systems we have currently available. So some brief examples of what this looks like, particularly for AI tools and clinical decision support. The most famous example, I think, in the entire field is the one on the top left that we just heard about in our last talk. Popular algorithm reducing the number of Black patients who should have been enrolled in high-risk care management programs by more than half. As this audience also knows, there are issues with inaccurate algorithms for things like sepsis, or examples of underdiagnosis bias in already underserved populations. And then we also get reports of bias in the medical use of large language models like GPT, where models can give different medical advice based on things like patient race or insurance status or demographic factors. So the questions on my mind from these kinds of studies is how can we build AI in a way that prevents these kinds of harms and can instead work to improve health outcomes and health equity? So that brings me to the first case I'm going to study today, which I think is focused on the people and process underlying some things that we've already talked a bit about in terms of monitoring and maintenance. These are areas that tend to be underdeveloped and underfunded in AI, and honestly just in our society in general that prioritizes innovation over maintenance. But I think that's a mistake, and I think it's perhaps particularly a mistake for AI. So to dive into the sort of ethics topics that I'm going to talk about in this particular case, I'm borrowing here from NIST guidelines on the characteristics of trustworthy AI systems. So over the course of the whole talk, I'm hoping that I can touch on each of these things, but the first case I'm going to discuss will highlight 3 of them. So first, an AI system has to be ethical. For it to be ethical, it has to be valid and reliable, or really what's the point of it? And that cuts across all these other factors. AI should be fair, with harmful bias managed, and explainable and interpretable. And the question of why we care about explainability and how to do that, I recognize are not obvious, but I'll talk a little bit more about that later. There are also a lot of frameworks in ethics that break down considerations by where they fall along the AI product lifecycle. I think that's a smart approach. There's questions to be answered in all of these phases. I'm just going to focus on post-deployment considerations today. I think they get the least amount of attention in ethics, but I think, again, that's a mistake. And they get that least amount of attention, I think, in practice as well. So to study ethics in this post-deployment monitoring phase, the first step for that for us is to conduct a qualitative interview study. So our primary research questions here are: how do key contributors assess the potential benefits and harms of an AI and ML model post-implementation? What monitoring and maintenance infrastructure do they use or wish they had to develop? And I'm presenting data which, in the context of qualitative research, mostly means quotations that represent the types of things that I've heard. And we conducted, so far, 20 interviews with clinicians, data scientists, computer scientists, engineers, and regulators who work on AI in healthcare settings. There are a few sort of key guiding social science concepts that I think are important to mention, some of which I'm shocked at how often this actual word, socio-technical, has come up in this space. I think that's an incredible win for science and technology studies, frankly, and ethics, to get that term into these conversations. So what I mean by this, there are a million definitions, was that to be successful, an AI intervention must always be thought of in a system where social context, relationships, and power dynamics are central and not an afterthought. And that those dynamics play a huge role in how a tool actually works, as we've already discussed. And that quote that I just shared is from some work that I think is a great example of this, if you're looking for it, from some of my former colleagues at Data and Society Research Institute, which I worked at before coming to NYU. So they published a report on sort of the social work required to integrate a sepsis prediction model at Duke. And that report is called Repairing Innovation. And I think what they demonstrate so nicely is that if we think of technology as disruptive, as is often the language of the Silicon Valley, at least, or of technology more generally, there's also and always corresponding repair work to complete the process of effective innovation. So in the case of the sepsis model at Duke, they were really focused on the unanticipated work that nurses needed to do to make the sepsis model fit into the existing clinical workflow at Duke. And it's a great project, so I would recommend reading it if you haven't seen it. So yeah, it's my job to sort of think through these very human and social contexts that matter so much to the governance and performance of an AI system. And another social science theory that I find quite valuable is the notion of strategic ignorance. This is something that often makes it difficult to monitor for harms by our health systems. And the general theory here, this comes from sociology, but I think a lot of fields have a similar version of the same concept. It's an idea that ignorance can serve as a valuable organizational resource because it can make inconvenient facts less visible. So strategic ignorance is distinguishable from deception or the suppression of data by virtue of the fact that unsettling knowledge is thwarted from emerging in the first place, making it difficult to hold individuals legally liable for knowledge they can claim to have never possessed. And the basic idea is that organizations, either consciously or unconsciously, set themselves up in a way where they're shielded from liability because they didn't actively seek out ways to know how their practices might be causing harm. And I think we see this a lot in AI, where a tool might be deployed, but we're not really tracking how well it works in different populations for a bunch of reasons. But I think in part because we might be scared of what we found. And so in the back of my mind, when I'm trying to understand monitoring governance and infrastructure, I want to think about how we can better design them to get out of this pattern of strategic ignorance. So I think the most unsurprising finding from the qualitative research we conducted is that monitoring infrastructure is really in its infancy. So I'm going to present some quotes that represent things that I heard people say quite commonly. So the first is an example from a chief medical information officer at a health system who said, monitoring is the hardest part. People need to realize that about 5 years ago, we weren't monitoring anything. Like nobody, you weren't doing anything. So to an extent, something would be better than nothing. And so early on, we said, well, geez, just check it once a year, at least for now. We need to do something, and we're not doing anything. But now it needs to be more nuanced than that. Well, here a clinician was also saying, yeah, what we do right now is pretty elementary. We put a tool into use, we look at its performance at some point down the road, and assess whether or not its overall performance metrics match what it was originally published at. So I would say that's the current state. At the same time that we know our monitoring structures aren't fully developed, we also know that monitoring is critical to good performance over time. There have been a ton of studies on this by now, including some that we've already heard about from this morning. The image I have from the slide is from a Stat News article, in collaboration with MIT researchers, finding that their models predicted things like duration of hospitalization, sepsis, likelihood of death. These were all declining in performance significantly over a few years, even if they were trained on data from the same health system where they were used. And I think what Stat has actually been really good at doing in their reporting over the past few years is showing how we're often waiting for a model to be broken enough to notice before we repair or remove it. But as others have talked about, that loses the trust of the users who have either started to ignore it because they know it doesn't work, or we're harming patients along the way that could be prevented if we had better monitoring. So I think everyone agrees at this point, when I talk to them at least, that monitoring is an important task, but how to do it is still debatable. I'm not going to talk as much about the technical side that we heard quite a bit about in really exciting ways this morning. We know that one of the most popular ways to monitor AI tool performance is by tracking performance metrics with dashboards. Obviously, that's a great idea. The interviews that I've done with folks in the field suggest that they don't really have a complete or a standard set of metrics. So dashboards are looking different in different places. There is a lot of good work on the technical side about what those metrics should be. I know many of you in this room are more equipped to talk about that than I am. So instead, I'm going to focus on sort of the people and process side of things that we can develop to understand those metrics and to understand how they should be used. And that brings me to another tricky question, which is how can we actually see harm in these systems if we're looking for it, or hopefully prevent it? So we generally track things like overall performance metrics. This can make it quite difficult to see what or how an individual or group harm might look like. So this is a AI governance scholar talking about this question. He said, demonstrating causation is going to be really challenging. When you get injured, healthcare is already kind of a credence good. It's hard to know whether something went right or wrong because of what the physician did or didn't do, as opposed to the fact that you're already sick, which is why you needed healthcare in the first place. So when we layer the opacity of algorithmic systems working in the backdrop on top of those, often it's going to be problematic. I mean, if somebody makes an algorithm that gives a ton of pregnant women teratogens, yeah, okay, we'll catch that one. But like, was it wrong for that patient because it wasn't adequately trained on that particular ethnic group? That's going to be harder to catch. I hope we catch it. I hope we have robust data systems and we recognize those patterns. I don't have tremendous confidence that these are the kinds of systems in place at the moment. And I think we've seen a lot of good qualitative examples of this. The quote that I'm showing here isn't actually from my study. It's from a group of researchers at Duke, who I think this paper is really terrific. So they were also talking to people working on AI in healthcare, and they would just hear things like, I don't think we really have a great understanding of how to measure an algorithm's performance, let alone its performance across race and ethnic groups. Here we also have another participant in my study that was describing sort of the human work that it would take to identify patterns that are otherwise easy to miss. So he said, maybe it's just every now and then nurses who are users for a hypothetical tool notice that it didn't work well for a middle-aged Muslim woman or something like that. But they don't see that many Muslim middle-aged women, and so one nurse notices it here, another notices it for a patient, and then a few months later, this patient. Then another nurse later in the year had a similar kind of thing, but they all feel like one-offs. And how do you have eyes on the whole process to stitch those different things together into a pattern? I think it's a very tricky problem to solve, which is why I don't see a lot of people solving it. And I think it would be possible with the right level of institutional support and maybe the right technical monitoring things there. And I think that brings me to the second aspect that I think is so critical to ethical monitoring of AI, which is who's actually responsible for noticing poor performance. And I think the way this often gets discussed in the literature, outside of technical monitoring, dashboards, things like that, is that we will keep this human in the loop that will be able to spot problems, and that person can sort of successfully assess whether a model's output for a particular patient makes sense and is worth considering. But I think recently there's been some good work, and we heard this in our interviews a bunch of times, suggesting that that idea that we can rely on this human in the loop to spot problems is probably insufficient. So here is another AI governance scholar in a health system who said, I'm a little bit worried that we're just going to rely too uncritically on humans in the loop to solve problems. I think we offload too much of this onto physicians with the idea that, yeah, okay, look, we're not going to have super robust governance at the local level. It'd be nice if we could, but that's resource intense. But don't worry, at least we have the physician who will check and make sure that, it's appropriate for their patient in their particular circumstance. And I'm just deeply mistrustful. It's like you've got a soccer team and you're like, cool, everybody off the field except the goalie. The one goalie, way to go, you got this. And I think, to me, this is an argument about why we need process and infrastructure in addition to the humans in the loop, because to put this all on clinicians, both in our interviews with them and just anecdotally in conversations I'm sure many of us have had, are too overworked or or feel like they don't have the required expertise to do this on their own. One of the ways that I think folks often seek to empower the human in the loop is by building explainability into AI systems in a bunch of different ways. Things like the model card, the nutrition label, et cetera. Model card here developed by Margaret Mitchell and Tim Ngebru. This would provide users of an algorithmic system with information about model details, its uses, its performance metrics, evaluation data, all of that. Importantly, also thinking about its caveats and limitations. And it's not that I oppose this. I'm all in favor of it. I think it's important for users to have some understanding of what they're looking at if they seek it out. But this, to me, doesn't seem like a sufficient solution. For example, we have a lot of studies at this point about automation bias in clinical decision support, where users are over-reliant on automated decision support, favoring suggestions from those systems, even in the face of contradictory information. And that doesn't seem to go away with traditional forms of explainability like model cards. There's more recent work that I think is trying to build user interfaces and accompanying systems of integration that can include things like a cognitive forcing function, which are interventions that are applied at the decision-making time to apply sort of heuristic reasoning, cause a person to engage, they disrupt heuristic reasoning. They cause a person to engage in analytic thinking. So that could be something like a checklist, a diagnostic timeout, asking a person to explicitly rule out an alternative. And I think, to me, it's this kind of implementation science that's going to be really quite critical. So what infrastructure do we need to support the people that actually use or are affected by the tools? And I'll say that in the interviews that we've conducted so far, we hear people mention pretty universally the importance of building this infrastructure, but it's been incredibly rare to actually hear about things that people have tried. I think it's going to take a lot of trial and error to get these things right, but obviously the testing is worth doing. So again, when I'm thinking about who is responsible for noticing poor performance, I'd first suggest it's not the people that we're often defaulting to now, which is the overworked clinician who might not have enough understanding about how these systems work or the time, even if they're presented with some basic information about it. We need more checks and balances than that. So then what are the next steps that I'm taking from this study so far? So one part of the process that we could build now, and some institutions are starting to do this, this is an idea that came from a research participant who was using the metaphor of a car service manual. And what he said is basically, every 5,000 miles you do this, every 15,000 miles you do this. It's standardized. Obviously not everyone follows it, but it gives you a manual for exactly what are the intervals. I'd love to see that in the future. Every 3 months we examine data drift, we examine the performance of the model. Every year we examine some other aspect of the model in a more comprehensive way, and that gets fed up into a structure that understands it's humans and machines. And then we have a decision made about whether or not we need to replace something like that. There are other ways, I think, of doing this rather than being focused on a particular time, as we heard about this morning. There could be other metrics for when we need to check in. The thing that I like about the idea of a car service manual or something akin to that is that it's a process that we've thought through in advance about what are the things that we're really trying to optimize for, who are the people that are going to check on it. And I think it can have some pretty universal features like monitoring for data drift, but also some things that are more specific to a particular model or a particular condition. So I want to see these types of things developed before we deploy a model. And I recognize, even as I say that might slow down the process. That is always what ethicists are accused of doing. But I do think that especially for systems that have real impact on patient outcomes, a slowdown should not impede innovation, but instead it should make that innovation actually robust and usable, and lead it towards success rather than failure. And then to create accountability and responsibility, it seems clear to me that many institutions, although not all, would need new teams, new departments, and funding structures to build sustainable monitoring procedures. And I think the exact nature of that, I've learned from talking to folks at different institutions, seems heavily dependent on the existing structures there. At least half of the participants that we've spoken to so far said that they're looking at places like Duke for a model of how they build these teams and structures, although I will also note that probably the second most recognized institution is the University of Michigan. And they've published a lot about this in places like Duke, Michigan, et cetera. So I think we can look there for examples. And I also want to suggest that we shouldn't be afraid of getting things wrong if we are at least doing our best to make sure we're getting them right. So we should build process that allows us to defend the choices we made with the information we had at the time. And I think the quote here on the slide is a nice example of that from a machine learning engineer who said, I think you just sort of go with your gut and assemble the right multi-stakeholder team such that if you do realize you got it wrong, you can share the blame together. And you could say, I was including patient voices, I was including nurses' voices. And in retrospect, we should have done something different, but this was our best guess at the time. This wasn't just me being an executive decision maker. And I think, frankly, this is the right path to get started, at least build something and be able to defend the process. And hopefully that process can shift and adjust to new developments or new contexts. It might not always get things right, but at least it gives us a good chance of getting in the right place. I want to talk now about a second case, quite different, bringing up some of the other key ethics issues in this space, and that's focused on ambient AI for clinical documentation, which I know we've also talked a little bit about already. But to clarify what I mean by that, I mean products like Nuance DAX, owned by Microsoft, using GPT-4 to analyze recordings of clinic visits in real time and produce both a transcript and a clinic note that a provider could integrate into an electronic health record. And here's an example of a clinician would open the DAX app on their phone. It would display the screen. on the left, when it is recording the conversation in the visit, and then it would provide a summary or a note. This is a tool that is being actively piloted in health systems across the country, including my own. And I think folks are quite excited about its potential to free clinicians from their intensive documentation burden. And I think there's also thought that this technology could allow clinicians to spend more time in real conversations with their patients rather than being stuck to their computers. At the same time, these tools do bring a range of ethics concerns. I'm going to touch on the ones, again, from this NIST Trustworthy AI structure that I didn't talk about last time. So this is whether technology is safe, whether it's secure and resilient, whether it's privacy enhanced, and whether it's accountable and transparent. So for this project, which again is also still ongoing, we conducted both a patient survey and clinician interviews, and our primary research question was, how can ambient AI documentation be integrated safely, securely, and transparently? So far we've talked to 11 primary care physicians testing this product at NYU, and then conducted an online survey of 103 patients so far. So I want to present some of the data from the patient interview. And the first thing I think to mention is that how we chose to initially describe this technology in the survey is how it was often described to patients by their doctor before a visit. So many times, as you'll see in the slide, most participants, and they would be allow their doctor to use this form of ambient AI. And the common way that we saw consent conversations go was something really simple. It was something like, hello, before we start, I'm using a new technology that helps me take notes by recording our visit. It allows me to be more efficient and focus better on you. Would that be okay? And it was a short conversation. And one thing that we've learned is that it does matter how you present this technology to patients and the type of information and language that you include. So we tried a few different things in our survey, including the phrasing that you see on the slide, which is, your doctor is using a technology called ambient AI, which audio records your visit and uses artificial intelligence technology to automatically summarize your visit into a format that's easy for your doctor to review. Your doctor can use this summary to remember your visit and make decisions about your care. This technology often works very well, but can also make errors. Your doctor uses this technology in partnership with a for-profit technology company. What would you do in this situation? And again, we still see that most people would allow their doctors to use this technology, but many more would answer no, would censor what they say to their doctor, or have more questions. Another thing we learned is that the type of visit and the issues discussed mattered quite a bit to whether patients felt comfortable using a technology like this. So for things like a routine physical, patients reported fairly high levels of comfort, but for other topics that was much less true. So if we were discussing, for example, sexual health with their doctor, patients were more likely to say that they would censor what they said to their doctor if using ambient AI. And in our free response data, we also saw this. So on the slide, there's a participant who said, I think there are pros and cons with this technology. I like that if my doctor rushes the appointment or doesn't listen to me, the AI will. However, in this political climate, it's even more important to protect health information for women. I would be terrified that this information could be gathered and used against me. I think this participant is raising the context of the reversal of Roe, the reduction of women's reproductive rights, as a reason for why having recordings or transcripts of her visits might actually make her quite uncomfortable. And then also on the topic of sensitive data, patients also reported fairly high levels of discomfort with the idea that their doctor could share patient data or recordings back to the technology company so that the company could improve their model or their product. I think all of the questions in this segment of the survey suggested that the key issue for patients when considering this technology was really related to data privacy, security, and confidentiality. It was frankly like a lot less about the AI summaries or what the AI was doing. Sometimes we heard questions about that. The real issue was the recording and what that meant. And then on the flip side, patients also seemed excited about the idea that if they're going to have their visits recorded, they want access to the recordings. So a participant said, would I get this recording myself, like MyChart, or for instance, stores data, and there's other services like it. Would the recording be in that so I could review? It would be awesome if so. And I want to clarify that I have not heard of any health systems willing to give patients access to their transcript, but I can think of many reasons, and like I understand why they wouldn't want to do that, but I think also for asking patients to take this additional risk with their personal data or in the service of easing the burdens on the health systems and the clinicians, I think it is worth considering about what we could offer to them as a direct benefit. And the transcript might be part of that. So I think it's something at least that I'd like to put on the table. And then getting patient input is also, I think, key to understanding what people value and what their concerns are. So we saw some folks who were really critical, saying things like, what's the ulterior motive of the company behind this? If the doctor is confident, why do I need another half brain in the room? Is this a method to be used as education? Is dumbed down and our doctors are really no longer well-trained as they were in the past? Or I'm skeptical of anything AI related, frankly. Or another person who used ChatGPT with their kids' homework and found that it wasn't very helpful and doesn't feel confident in this case either. Or then most strongly, we heard some participants saying, I would immediately opt out, and if I was informed after the fact this was used, I would consider litigation. On the flip side, there were others who were more positive, and that positivity really seemed to come down to their trust in their doctor, which is something I think we've already touched on here, to do what was in their best interest. So a couple of examples of that. Since I already trust my doctor with my personal and sensitive information, I don't see why I wouldn't trust them to use something that makes taking notes easier for them. If I didn't trust them, I wouldn't have them as my doctor, and they could just sell my information anyway without recording it. Also, if this new technology works well, it might allow them to remember things they wouldn't have before, leading to better decisions about my health. Or another example, I trust my doctor. I also know what a big role technology plays in all our lives these days, and technology's role is only growing. It seems reasonable to me for my doctor to use the latest technology to make her job easier, but also to provide me, the patient, with even more of her attention and focus. And then finally, we also asked some questions about consent procedures and when they should occur for this type of technology. So most patients wanted to be first informed via a text or a call a few days before the appointment, then followed up with either at staff at check-in or by their doctor at the start of the appointment. And I think right now for many institutions, the conversations are just happening at the time of appointment. So that is, I think, helpful feedback that we're trying to integrate. And if I had to summarize all of this patient feedback, I want to highlight that the patient concerns that we heard the most really have, again, nothing to do with AI, more to do with data privacy and security, which is something that we've been facing for many years now in healthcare and in other sectors. So I think for me, a lot of the work that I ended up doing in AI ethics really isn't new. It is almost never new, actually. It is built from practices and drawing from things that we should have learned a long time ago from the integration of electronic health records themselves. But at the same time, I don't think we've really developed consensus on how to do things like data privacy well. We still see breaches. We still see that it's a real concern for both patients and providers across a range of different technologies or activities. So there's a lot to do here, but I think AI brings greater light to these problems that we've had for a long time. Another thing that we heard pretty frequently in our conversations with the clinicians that were piloting ambient AI for clinical documentation was a concern about patient safety and the future of clinician expertise. So often when I see integrations of this kind of technology, folks are often focused on whether it could increase efficiency, whether it could reduce physician burnout, and the time they spend on documentation. Obviously, those are great things. But I'll always argue that these technologies should still be evaluated in a way that's similar to how we test other forms of medical intervention. So how does this affect patient outcomes, even if that's sort of a downstream effect of their use or reason for their use? So a bunch of clinicians said things like, during training, use notes to create insights about patient care. My concern is that by using AI, you won't be doing this with your brain as much. You might be a worse doctor. Or that a huge part of our learning is active learning and the synthesis part. As I'm assembling symptoms, as I'm writing them, I don't want to lose that. So I think this is, to me, like a very much open empirical question. Is there some built-in critical reasoning built into the documentation process that's actually beneficial to clinician reasoning and patient outcomes? And I think that puts on the table that we should be testing technologies like this with that in mind, which patient outcomes in mind, with things like prospective clinical trials. I haven't seen that yet with this technology. I've recognized that there are challenges in how to actually set up a good trial in that setting, but I think it's worth trying. And then the final thing that I want to say on this case is something that I've learned from the historians of technology that I trained with. which is that AI and other technologies are often billed as those that can eliminate tedious work and they can enable more freedom. They can get us back to the place we wish we were. But I think there's actually a pretty clear pattern in the history of technology that suggests that technologies often create as much work as they alleviate. And then to give the most classic example of the field, I'm drawing from a book called More Work for Mother by Ruth Schwartz-Cohen. And she found that modern women devote as much time to housework as did their colonial sisters, despite new household technologies like washing machines, white flour, vacuums, and commercial cotton. So these technologies are marketed often towards women as allowing them to live lives of leisure. But instead, we've seen other things change. Our standards of cleanliness change. Our worlds change in ways that women are often still spending significant time on these same tasks, even with this new technology. And I mention that because I think that means to me that it's incredibly important to think in advance about how the time saved by technologies like ambient AI will be shifted to other purposes. So if our goal is to give doctors more time with their patients, or frankly, just like more time in their lives with their families, because they don't have to spend so much time on documentation, I think we need to vigorously defend that. Otherwise, I'm quite sure that that free time will be used to see more patients or to do even more tasks that doesn't touch this problem of physician burnout actually at all. So I want to be really intentional about how we allocate any time savings that we get from tools like this. Otherwise, we may repeat these things that we've seen in the history of technology. So finally, I'm just moving to my key takeaways from these two cases. So operationalizing the characteristics of trustworthy AI systems are not always straightforward. They should involve input from key stakeholders. People and process are as important as technology. I think many of us have had that here. I think it's also valuable to say here that there are a lot of folks in bioethics whose work is designed to understand the logic and the principles that can get us to the right answer for a question. I'm not a philosopher, that's not my expertise. So instead, I think there's also room in ethics for the work of building process and structure to ensure that the decisions that get made can be defensible because it was made in an ethical way. So what I mean by that is really like the right people are in the room and the right questions got asked. The second thing I'll say is that not all AI applications face the same kinds of ethics considerations. Context is super critical here. I think hopefully I can demonstrate from the two projects I focus on here that different concerns are top of mind in these different cases. How to do good monitoring is different from how to do safe, secure, transparent ambient AI. And I think one thing, though, that does connect the two cases, and that I think is actually universal, is that prospective evaluation and ongoing maintenance and infrastructure need to be prioritized much more than they are now. We can't really know if AI works or if it's ethical until we have data on how it functions in reality with the messiness of real life. So I would make the plug that as many of us recognize this as a problem, I think that social scientists and social science methods actually can be quite helpful in doing the work of how sort of understanding how a tool fits into an existing social structure. So I hope that we will continue to evolve. And frankly, even just seeing a lot of the vocab in this room, I think we're already coming to a shared language that I find really encouraging. So that's all I'll say. I want to briefly thank the collaborators working with me on these projects, Vasu Kuram, Daphne Levine, KP Tacconi, Kate Lawrence, Zach Griffin, and Lasya Damaraju. Thank you.